Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness echo through our lives in ways we never expect. There are moments when helping a stranger becomes the most important thing we ever do. When wealthy rancher Silas McCrae found a freezing woman on his porch, he gave her his coat and food without asking questions. She disappeared by morning, leaving only a whispered thank you. 3 years later, she returned with a little boy whose green eyes looked just like Silas's lost brother. The woman had been keeping a secret that would change everything Silas thought he knew about his family. What could connect this mysterious woman to the brother Silas had mourned for decades? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana wind carried a bite that December morning, whistling through the valley like a lonesome song. Silas McCrae stood at the window of his grand ranch house, watching the sun struggle to break through the grey clouds that had settled over Dry Hollow like a heavy blanket. At 58, he cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of too many seasons squinting into the harsh prairie sun. The house around him told a story of success that felt increasingly hollow with each passing year. Hand-carved mahogany furniture filled rooms that echoed with emptiness. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors that rarely heard footsteps beyond his own. Crystal chandeliers cast their light on walls, lined with books he'd bought but never read, paintings of landscapes more beautiful than the one outside his window, and photographs of cattle and horses that meant more to him than any person had in years. But it was the mantelpiece that drew his gaze every morning, the same way a wound draws a finger to test if it still hurts. There, in a place of honor above the cold fireplace, sat a glass case containing a single military medal, the Medal of Honor, awarded posthumously to his younger brother Thomas McCrae for gallantry in action during the Battle of Gettysburg. The Bronze Cross seemed to watch him, a constant reminder of the life cut short, the future that never came to pass. The words left, unspoken between brothers who thought they had all the time in the world. Thomas had been everything. Silas wasn't gentle where Silas was hard, thoughtful where Silas was impulsive, beloved by everyone who met him, while Silas earned respect through grit and determination. The boy had possessed a poet's soul in a warrior's world, writing letters home filled with observations about the changing seasons and questions about the meaning of suffering. He'd enlisted not out of hunger for glory, but from a quiet sense of duty that made him pack his Bible alongside his rifle. The war had taken Thomas just 3 months before its end, leaving Silas to build an empire on land they'd planned to work together. Every fence post driven into the frozen ground, every head of cattle branded with the McCrae mark, every dollar earned and saved, all of it had been in service of a dream Thomas would never see. The success felt like a monument to failure, prosperity built on the foundation of profound loss. "Morning, boss," Jake Henley's voice cut through Silas's brooding. The ranch foreman stood in the doorway, hat in his weathered hands, snow still dusting his coat. Jake had worked the day. McCrae land for 15 years, arriving as a drifter and staying long enough to become the closest thing Silas had to a friend. Cattle are restless today. Storms coming in hard by evening, I'd wager. Silas turned from the window, grateful for the interruption. How hard? Bad enough. Tommy's already moving the herd to the lower pasture, and Maria's stocking the bunkhouse with extra firewood. Jake studied his employer's face with the practiced eye of a man who'd learned to read the weather in another man's mood. "You eating these days?" Cook's been asking. The question carried weight, beyond its simple words. In the 3 years since Silas had found the woman on his porch, his habits had shifted in ways that worried those who depended on him. Where once he'd joined the ranch hands for meals, sharing stories and checking on their families, now he often forgot to eat at all, lost in thoughts that seemed to pull him deeper into himself with each passing season. "I'll take something later." Silas moved toward his desk, where ledgers and correspondence waited in neat stacks. The business of ranching never paused for personal grief, and the McCrae spread had grown into one of the largest operations in 3 counties. "Any word from the bank?" Jake's expression darkened. "Porter was by yesterday while you were in town. Says the railroad's still sniffing around, making offers on the Henderson place and the Murphy spread. Big money, from what I hear." The railroad. For months, rumors had circulated about plans for a new line that would cut through the valley, bringing with it the promise of progress and the threat of change. Developers had begun appearing in Dry Hollow like crows before a storm, armed with surveys and contracts, speaking of a future where cattle gave way to commerce and the old ways yielded to efficiency. Silas had built his life on this land, using the inheritance left by his parents and the sweat of his own labor to create something lasting. The idea of selling even an acre felt like betraying not just his own work, but Thomas's memory. This was where they'd planned to raise their families, where Thomas had dreamed of teaching his children to ride and rope and understand the rhythms of the natural world. "What did you tell Porter?" "Same thing you told me to tell him. The McCrae land isn't for sale." Jake shifted his weight, the floorboards creaking under his boots. "But boss, some of these offers they're making, they're life-changing money. Enough to buy a spread twice this size up in Canada, with plenty left over for retirement. Money. As if money had ever been the point." Silas's gaze drifted back to Thomas's medal, remembering the letter that had come with it. The commanding officer had written about Thomas's final act, charging into enemy fire to save a wounded companion, knowing the risk, accepting it because that's who he was. A man who understood that some things mattered more than personal safety. "This land isn't for sale, Jake. Not to the railroad, not to developers, not to anyone." The conviction in his voice seemed to satisfy the foreman, who nodded and moved toward the door. But he paused at the threshold, looking back with the expression of a man wrestling with words. "Boss, I don't mean to overstep, but you've been carrying something heavy these past few years. Heavier than usual, I mean. If you ever want to talk about whatever's eating at you, I appreciate it, Jake, really, but some burdens are meant to be carried alone." After Jake left, Silas returned to the window, watching the ranch hands go about their morning routines. Tommy Rodriguez guided the cattle toward lower ground with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle. Maria Santos hung laundry on lines that snapped and danced in the wind, her movements efficient despite the cold. These people depended on him, trusted him to keep their jobs secure and their futures stable. They'd become the closest thing to family he'd allowed himself since Thomas died. But family was more complicated than employment, requiring a kind of vulnerability Silas had learned to avoid. It was easier to be the boss, the provider, the man who made decisions and bore responsibility. Relationships of equality demanded too much risk of loss, too much potential for the kind of pain he'd felt when Thomas never came home from the war. The woman who'd appeared on his porch 3 years ago had awakened something in him that he'd thought permanently buried. Not romantic love, she'd been too mysterious, too damaged for that, but something deeper and more dangerous. Compassion, the recognition of shared human frailty. For one night, taking care of her had made him feel useful in a way that had nothing to do with business, success, or social standing. He'd given her his coat, his food, his warmth, asking nothing in return because she clearly had nothing to give. She'd accepted his kindness with the dignity of someone who understood its value, speaking little but watching him with eyes that seemed to see past the walls he'd built around himself. When she'd whispered, "Thank you," in the grey hour before dawn, it had sounded like a prayer. Then she'd vanished, leaving behind only questions and a strange sense of incompleteness that had haunted him ever since. He'd tried to forget her, to return to the comfortable isolation that had served him for so many years. But forgetting proved impossible. She'd become a presence in his daily life as real as Thomas's medal, A reminder that connection with another human being was still possible, even for a man who'd convinced himself he was better off alone. The storm Jake had predicted began to show itself in the distance, dark clouds building on the horizon like an advancing army. In a few hours, the valley would be locked in winter's grip, the kind of weather that tested both livestock and the people who tended them. It was the same kind of storm that had driven the woman to his door 3 years ago, and despite himself, Silas found his thoughts turning toward the possibility of another lost soul seeking shelter. But lightning, they said, never struck the same place twice, and men like him didn't get second chances at redemption. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending snow devils dancing across the pasture. Somewhere in the house, a door creaked on its hinges, and for just a moment, Silas allowed himself to imagine what it might be like if these rooms held more than echoes, if there were voices at the dinner table, laughter in the hallways, the warm chaos of a family gathered around the fire on a night like this. Then he turned away from the window and reached for his ledgers, burying himself in numbers and projections, in the safe and predictable world of profit and loss. Outside, the storm continued to build, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice wondered if the woman with the grateful eyes had found a place to weather whatever storms had come her way since that winter night when kindness had been enough to save her. The storm arrived with the fury Jake had predicted, transforming the December evening into a howling wilderness of wind and snow. By 8 o'clock, the world beyond the ranch house windows had disappeared into a wall of white that seemed to swallow the very idea of warmth and shelter. Silas sat in his study, the fire crackling in the grate, trying to focus on correspondence that had arrived that morning from his lawyer in Helena. The railroad matter was growing more complicated. 3 neighboring ranches had already signed preliminary agreements, and the pressure on holdouts was increasing. The letter detailed offers that would make any reasonable man wealthy beyond his current dreams, but Silas found himself unmoved by numbers that might as well have been written in a foreign language. This land wasn't a commodity to be traded. It was the foundation of everything he'd built in Thomas's memory. A sound from outside cut through his thoughts, not the wind, which had been constant for hours, but something else. A thump against the front porch, followed by a scraping noise that made him look up from his papers. Probably a tree branch blown loose, or debris from the storm finding its way against the house. But the sound came again, deliberate and rhythmic, like someone knocking. Silas set down his pen and listened. Who would be traveling in weather like this? Jake and the other hands were secure in the bunkhouse, and no one from town would venture out unless it was a matter of life and death. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and old Murphy wouldn't leave his own hearth on a night when the devil himself would think twice about going outside. The knocking resumed, weaker now but persistent. Someone was definitely out there. Silas grabbed a lantern and made his way to the front door, his boots echoing in the empty hallway. When he pulled back the heavy wooden barrier, the wind nearly tore it from his hands, driving snow and ice into his face like needles. At first, he saw nothing but the swirling white chaos of the blizzard. Then his lantern light caught something. Dark against the porch boards, a figure huddled against the side of the house, barely visible beneath a mound of snow that had already begun to bury her. Because it was definitely a woman, he could see that much as he stepped outside, the cold hitting him like a physical blow. She was unconscious, or nearly so, her lips blue with cold and her breathing shallow. Her clothes were thin and worn, more suitable for autumn than the brutal Montana winter, and her hands, her hands were bare and white as the snow that covered them. She must have been walking for hours to reach his porch, probably following the fence line that led from the main road to his house. Without hesitation, Silas scooped her up in his arms, surprised by how light she felt, how fragile. She stirred slightly at his touch, mumbling something he couldn't understand, but didn't wake. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the wind. and made his way to the sitting room where the fire burned brightest. He settled her on the sofa closest to the hearth and began the careful process of warming someone who'd come dangerously close to freezing to death. First, he removed her wet outer clothes, a threadbare coat that wouldn't have kept a person warm in October, let alone December. Her dress underneath was better quality but still damp with melted snow, and he could see she was shivering violently even in her unconscious state. From the linen closet, he brought blankets and quilts, wrapping her carefully while trying to preserve her modesty. His housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, would have known better how to tend to a woman in such circumstances, but she lived in town and wouldn't be back until the storm passed. Silas would have to manage on his own. The woman's face, now that he could see it clearly in the firelight, was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 30, with auburn hair that had escaped its pins and lay damp against her shoulders. She had good bones, as his mother would have said, the kind of features that spoke of breeding even when circumstances had clearly been difficult. There was something familiar about her, though he couldn't place what it might be. As her shivering began to subside, Silas went to the kitchen and prepared a simple broth, heating it slowly on the stove while keeping one ear tuned for sounds from the side. A sitting room. When he returned with a bowl and spoon, he found her eyes open, brown eyes that watched him with a mixture of wariness and gratitude. "Easy now," he said, setting the bowl on the side table and helping her sit up. "You're safe. This is the McCrae ranch, and you're welcome here as long as you need to be." She tried to speak, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "Don't apologize. Anyone would have done the same." He offered her the spoon, noting how her hands shook as she took it. "Can you manage some broth? It'll help warm you from the inside." She nodded and began eating slowly, each spoonful seeming to bring a bit more life back into her features. As color returned to her cheeks, Silas found himself studying her more carefully. There was an intelligence in her eyes that suggested education, and despite her rough circumstances, she carried herself with a dignity that spoke of better times. "I'm Silas McCrae," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "This is my ranch. Might I ask your name?" She hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. "Mary," she said finally. "Mary Catherine O'Brien." Irish then, which explained the auburn hair and the fine bone structure. There'd been waves of Irish immigrants through Montana over the past decade, some finding success, others struggling to adapt to the harsh realities of frontier life. From her condition, Mary Catherine O'Brien belonged to the latter group. "How did you come to be walking in a blizzard, Miss O'Brien?" Again, the hesitation. "Mrs." she corrected quietly. "I'm a widow." She set down the spoon and pulled the blankets more tightly around herself. "My husband died 2 years ago. I've been making my way since then." The careful phrasing told Silas more than a detailed explanation might have. She'd been drifting, probably moving from job to job, town to town, trying to survive in a world that had little patience for women without protection or resources. The storm had caught her between destinations, and his ranch had been the only shelter she could reach. "Well, Mrs. O'Brien, you'll stay here until the weather clears and you're strong enough to travel. I won't hear any argument about it." Something shifted in her expression, surprise perhaps, or relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. I don't know anything about me," she said. "I could be anyone. You're someone who nearly froze to death on my porch. That's all I need to know." As she finished the broth, they talked quietly about safe subjects, the storm, the difficulty of travel in winter, the way Montana weather could change, from mild to deadly in the span of an hour. She spoke carefully, revealing little about her past, beyond the basic facts of widowhood and hardship, but Silas sensed depths beneath her reserve that intrigued him. When her eyelids began to droop with exhaustion, he showed her to the guest room on the ground floor, providing her with dry clothes that had belonged to his housekeeper and ensuring the fireplace was well stoked for the night. As he bid her good night, she caught his hand with surprising strength. "Thank you," she whispered, and the simple words carried a weight of emotion that made his chest tighten. "You saved my life tonight. Get some rest, Mrs. O'Brien. Tomorrow will take care of itself." But as Silas returned to his study, he found sleep impossible. Something about the woman troubled him, not in a suspicious way, but in the manner of a half-remembered melody that hovered just beyond recognition. Her voice, her manner of speaking, even the way she held her head when listening, all of it seemed connected to something in his past that he couldn't quite grasp. From her traveling bag, which he'd brought inside with her, a small object had fallen during the evening's commotion. A locket, silver and worn smooth with age, lay on the carpet near the hearth. He picked it up, meaning to return it to her in the morning, but in the firelight he could see that the catch had broken, revealing a photograph inside. The image was old and faded, but the face was one he knew as well as his own. Thomas McCrae, young and smiling, wearing the uniform he'd been so proud of before the war, taught him what pride could cost. Silas's hand trembled as he stared at the locket, his mind racing with possibilities and questions that had no easy answers. How could this woman possess a photograph of his dead brother? What connection could exist between a wandering widow and a man who'd been in his grave for 15 years? Outside, the storm continued its assault on the valley, but inside the ranch house, a different kind of tempest was beginning, one that would reshape everything. Silas McCrae thought he knew about his family, his past, and the mysterious ways that life could circle back upon itself with revelations that changed everything. 3 years had passed since Mary Catherine O'Brien disappeared from his ranch like morning mist, leaving behind only memories and unanswered questions that haunted Silas's quiet hours. The locket remained locked in his desk drawer, its secret burning like a coal in his chest, but the woman herself had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed at all. The ranch prospered, despite his distraction, or perhaps because of it. Work became his refuge from thoughts that led nowhere productive. He drove himself and his men harder, expanding the operation, improving bloodlines, building a reputation that stretched beyond Montana's borders. The McCrae brand became synonymous with quality, and buyers came from as far as Chicago to bid on his cattle. Yet success felt hollow when there was no one to share it with, no family to benefit from the legacy he was building. Jake Henley noticed the change, as did the other hands. Where Silas had once been a demanding but fair boss, he'd become something harder, not cruel, but distant in a way that created space between himself and everyone around him. He still paid well, still treated his employees with respect, but the easy camaraderie of earlier years had given way to a formal politeness that kept everyone at arm's length. "Boss seems to be carrying something heavy these days," Tommy Rodriguez observed one evening as the ranch hands gathered around the bunkhouse table for their weekly poker game. "Heavier than usual, I mean. Ever since that winter, 3 years back, when the woman showed up." Jake dealt the cards with practiced efficiency, his weathered face thoughtful. "Man's got a right to his private troubles. Lord knows we all carry our share." "Still," Maria Santos added, setting down mugs of coffee for the men, "it's not healthy, the way he keeps to himself. Mrs. Patterson says he barely touches his meals, spends most evenings locked up in that study of his." They all understood the weight of isolation. Frontier life demanded a certain self-sufficiency that could easily tip into loneliness. But Silas's withdrawal felt different, more deliberate, as if he was punishing himself for something none of them could understand. The truth was more complicated than his employees suspected. The discovery of Thomas's photograph in Mary O'Brien's locket had shattered assumptions Silas had held for 15 years. His brother had been a private man, gentle but not given to romantic attachments that Silas knew about. Yet, the photograph suggested a connection deep enough for a woman to carry his image across years of hardship and uncertainty. Unable to bear the mystery alone, Silas had begun a careful investigation. He'd written letters to Thomas's former commanding officers, to men who'd served alongside his brother, to anyone who might have knowledge of the relationships Thomas had formed during his brief military service. Most of the responses yielded nothing. Useful memories were unreliable after so many years, and war had a way of scattering men across the continent, many never to be heard from again. But one letter had changed everything. Captain William Morrison, now retired and living quietly in Virginia, had served directly under Thomas during the final months of the war. His response to Silas's careful inquiries contained information that had kept Silas awake for weeks afterward. "Your brother was indeed acquainted with a young woman during his service," Morrison had written in his careful script. "I believe her name was Mary Catherine, though I cannot recall her family name. She worked as a seamstress for one of the local families near our winter camp in '63, a fine young woman by all accounts, well-educated and of good character. Your brother spoke of her often during the final weeks of his service, though I was not privy to the details of their attachment. I regret to say that after Thomas's death, I never learned what became of her." The letter had confirmed Silas's growing suspicions while raising a dozen new questions. If Mary O'Brien was the same woman Thomas had known during the war, why had she never contacted the McCrae family after his death? Why had she been wandering alone and destitute when she clearly possessed intelligence and education? And most troubling of all, why had she seemed to recognize Silas's name when he'd introduced himself that storm-swept night? Driven by questions he couldn't answer, Silas had begun making discreet inquiries in the surrounding towns. He told himself he was simply trying to understand his brother's life, to fill in the gaps in a story that had remained incomplete for too long. But late at night, when honesty came easier, he admitted to a deeper motivation. The woman had awakened something in him that had nothing to do with Thomas's memory and everything to do with his own: loneliness. The search had proven frustrating and ultimately futile. Mary O'Brien had vanished as completely as smoke, leaving no trace in church records, town registries, or the memories of merchants and innkeepers Silas questioned. It was as if she'd deliberately chosen to disappear, to erase herself from any place where she might be found. Meanwhile, the pressure on ranch owners in the valley continued to mount. The railroad's plans had become more concrete, and the offers being made to landowners grew increasingly difficult to refuse. The Henderson place had finally sold, and the Murphy spread followed within a month. Fences were coming down, surveying crews appeared with regularity, and the talk in Dry Hollow's single saloon centered on progress and change. Silas remained unmoved by the offers that arrived with increasing frequency. His lawyer in Helena advised him to at the least consider the proposals. The money being offered could set him up comfortably for life, with enough left over to buy better land elsewhere. But Silas couldn't explain to anyone, not even his lawyer, that leaving this ranch would feel like abandoning Thomas all over again. It was in the heat of a July afternoon that he'd made the discovery that changed everything. Mrs. Patterson had asked him to clear out the attic, claiming that pack rats had taken up residence among the stored furniture and old trunks that had accumulated over the years. Silas had been putting off the chore for months, but the housekeeper's pointed comments about the smell finally motivated him to climb the narrow stairs and begin sorting through the detritus of decades. Most of what he found deserved to be burned: moth-eaten clothes, broken furniture, books damaged beyond salvation by years of temperature extremes. But in a trunk that had belonged to his parents, he discovered something that stopped him cold: a bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon, yellowed with age, and addressed to Thomas in a woman's careful handwriting. The return address read, M.C. O'Brien, Richmond, Virginia. With trembling hands, Silas had untied the ribbon and begun to read. The letters spanned 6 months in 1863 and 1864, chronicling a relationship that had clearly grown from friendship to something deeper. Mary Catherine's voice emerged from the pages with warmth and intelligence, sharing observations about the war's impact on civilian life, asking thoughtful questions about Thomas's experiences, expressing hopes for a future when peace would allow them to build a life together. The final letter, dated just 2 weeks before Thomas's death, contained news that made Silas's breath catch in his throat. "My dearest Thomas," Mary Catherine had written, "I pray this letter finds you well and safe. I have wonderful news that I hope will bring you joy even in these dark times. Come spring, you will be a father. Our child will be born in May, and I dream of the day when we three shall be together at last, when this terrible war is finally ended and we can begin the family we have planned." Thomas had died in April of 1864, never knowing he was to become a father, never receiving the letter that would have given his final sacrifice an entirely different meaning. And, somewhere, a child had been born who carried McCrae blood, raised by a woman who'd lost everything when the man she loved failed to come home from war. The wooden horse sat in Silas's weathered palm like a piece of crystallized memory, its surface worn smooth by countless hands and polished by time into a deep golden hue. He'd found it wrapped in cloth at the bottom of Thomas's old trunk, beneath letters that had been too painful to finish reading all at once. The craftsmanship was unmistakably his brother's work. Thomas had always possessed a gift with wood carving, able to coax life from dead timber with nothing more than a sharp knife and infinite patience. The horse was no larger than a man's fist, but every detail had been lovingly rendered. The flowing mane, the alert ears, the powerful muscles of the hindquarters captured in miniature. Along the base, carved in letters, so small they could barely be read, were the initials T.M., and below them, a date that made Silas's chest tighten with understanding: Christmas 1863. Thomas had carved this during the war, probably during those long winter months when Mary Catherine's letters spoke of their growing attachment and shared dreams. The date meant he'd made it as a Christmas gift, perhaps for her, or perhaps with the future in mind, the child they'd planned, the family they'd hoped to build when peace finally came. The toy represented everything Thomas had wanted, and everything the war had stolen from him. Silas set the horse on his desk next to the bundle of letters and stared at it until his vision blurred. For 15 years he'd grieved his brother as a fallen soldier, a young man cut down before he could experience the fullness of life. But Thomas hadn't died alone and unmourned. He'd died as a man in love, a man preparing to become a father, a man whose heart had been full even as his life was ending. The revelation changed everything and nothing simultaneously. Thomas was still dead, still beyond the reach of regret or reconciliation. But somewhere in the world, his child lived, would to be nearly 18 now, no longer the baby Mary Catherine had carried when she wrote those final letters. Did the child know who their father was? Had Mary Catherine told stories about the man who'd carved toys for a future he'd never see? Dr. Marcus Thornton found Silas in this contemplative state when he arrived for his monthly visit to the ranch. The doctor had been tending to the McCrae family for 20 years, had delivered Thomas, and later attended his funeral with tears in his eyes. At 72, Doc Thornton moved more slowly than in his younger days, but his mind remained sharp, and his capacity for listening had only deepened with age. "You look like a man wrestling with ghosts," the doctor observed, settling his considerable bulk into the chair across from Silas's desk. His eyes took in the wooden horse, the scattered letters, the hollow expression on his host's face. "Want to tell me about it?" Silas considered deflecting, as had become his habit over the years. But the weight of solitary knowledge had grown too heavy to bear alone, and if anyone could be trusted with family secrets, it was the man who'd helped bring Thomas into the world. Slowly, carefully, Silas told the story: the woman who'd appeared during the storm, The locket with Thomas's photograph, the letters that revealed a relationship and a child he'd never known existed. Doc Thornton listened without interruption, occasionally picking up one of the letters to examine the handwriting or nodding at some detail that confirmed his understanding. "So you believe this? Mary O'Brien, who stayed here 3 years ago, was the same woman who loved your brother during the war?" The doctor summarized when Silas finished. "The timing fits, the name fits, and she had his photograph." Silas picked up the wooden horse, turning it over in his hands. "But why didn't she tell me who she was? Why disappear without a word, when she must have known I'd want to help her?" Doc Thornton was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming thoughtfully against his knee. "Pride," he said finally. "And probably fear. Think about it from her perspective, Silas. She's a woman who's been struggling to survive for years, probably decades. Shows up at your door, half dead from cold and hunger. What's she supposed to say? 'Hello, I'm the woman your brother loved and I have his child?' She's got no proof beyond a locket and her word, and she's in no position to make claims on a family that's prospered while she's been scraping by." The doctor's words carried the ring of truth, but they also raised more questions. Then why come here at all? She could have taken shelter anywhere. Could she? Think about where we are, Silas. Your ranch is known throughout 3 counties. The McCrae name is on everyone's lips when they talk about successful cattle operations. If she'd been carrying the knowledge of her connection to your family for years, where else would she go? When she was desperate, this place would have called to her like a moth to flame. Silas nodded slowly, beginning to understand. But when she got here and saw how well I lived, how successful the ranch had become, she probably felt like more of an outsider than ever. Here's this woman who's been struggling just to survive, and she sees the wealth that's been built on land that might have been her home if things had gone differently. Maybe she felt like she didn't belong, like claiming kinship would look like grasping for money. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses, approaching at speed. Through the window, Silas could see Jake riding hard toward the house, his face grim with purpose. Behind him came Tommy Rodriguez, both men pushing their mounts harder than was wise in the afternoon heat. Silas and the doctor went out to meet them, and Jake dismounted while his horse was still moving. "Boss, we got trouble. Big trouble. Murphy's spread isn't being turned into railroad right-of-way like we thought. They're surveying it for a whole town, hotels, shops, maybe even a mining operation. Word is, they've found mineral deposits up in the hills that could change everything." The news hit Silas like a physical blow. A railroad was one thing, inconvenient but manageable. But a mining town meant hundreds of workers, dozens of businesses, noise and pollution, and the complete transformation of the valley they'd all known their entire lives. It meant the end of the ranching way of life that had sustained families for generations. How certain is this information? Certain enough. Tommy was in town when the surveying crew stopped for supplies. They were talking pretty freely about time frames and development plans. Seems like they're moving faster than anyone expected. Doc Thornton laid a hand on Silas's shoulder. "I know this isn't what you wanted to hear, especially not today, but maybe it's time to seriously consider those offers. The writing might be on the wall whether we like it or not." But Silas was no longer thinking about railroad offers or mining developments. A new possibility had taken root in his mind, growing from the seeds of the letters he'd been reading and the wooden horse that represented dreams deferred but not destroyed. If Mary Catherine O'Brien was still alive, if Thomas's child was out there, somewhere, then the McCrae family wasn't as finished as he'd believed. The land he'd been trying to preserve for the sake of memory might yet serve its intended purpose, providing a foundation for the future, a legacy that could pass from one generation to the next, as his parents had intended. But first, he had to find them, and judging by the way the world was changing around him, time was running shorter than he'd thought. As the men discussed the implications of the mining development, Silas found himself scanning the horizon as if expecting to see a familiar figure walking toward his ranch. Somewhere out there, his brother's story continued in the life of a child who carried McCrae blood. Finding that child, bringing that family home, had suddenly become more important than any business decision he'd ever faced. The wooden horse seemed to pulse with warmth in his palm, a tangible connection to dreams that had survived war, loss, and the long years of believing some things were gone forever. The carriage appeared on the horizon like a mirage born from desperate hope and answered prayers. Silas watched it from his study window, the familiar black speck growing, larger as it followed the winding road that led to the McCrae ranch. For 3 months, he'd been haunting nearby towns, making inquiries, following rumors that led nowhere. He'd almost convinced himself that Mary Catherine O'Brien had vanished from the earth entirely, taking Thomas's child with her, into whatever shadows had swallowed her past. But now, on this clear September morning with autumn painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson, someone was coming to call. And something in the deliberate pace of the approaching vehicle, the way it stayed to the main road instead of hurrying, suggested this wasn't a casual visit. Jake appeared in the doorway, his expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Boss, looks like you got company coming. Nice carriage too, not the kind of rig you see much around these parts." Silas straightened his vest and ran a hand through his hair, suddenly conscious of his appearance in a way he hadn't been for years. "I see it. Probably someone from the railroad or the mining company coming to make another offer we'll refuse." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't true. The carriage was too modest for corporate representatives, and the pace, too, measured for men accustomed to quick business and quicker departures. This felt personal, deliberate, like someone gathering courage for a conversation that had been postponed too long. When the carriage finally drew to a stop in front of the house, Silas found himself holding his breath. The driver was a woman in a simple brown dress, her auburn hair now showing threads of silver but still recognizable despite the years that had passed. Mary Catherine O'Brien sat straight-backed on the driver's seat, her hands steady on the reins despite the obvious emotion playing across her features. Beside her sat a boy who made Silas's heart skip with recognition so profound it was almost painful. The child couldn't be more than 17, tall for his age, but still carrying the gangliness of youth. His hair was dark, like Thomas's had been, and when he turned to look at the ranch house, Silas saw eyes, the exact shade of green that had looked back at him from mirrors his entire life, the unmistakable McCrae eyes that had been passed down through 3 generations. Silas walked out to meet them, his legs unsteady beneath him as he approached the carriage. Mary Catherine climbed down with practiced grace, her movements more assured than they'd been during that desperate winter night 3 years ago. She was still beautiful, he noted with surprise, but it was the beauty of a woman who'd found her strength rather than the fragile attractiveness of someone barely surviving. "Mrs. O'Brien," he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Mr. McCrae." She studied his face with the same careful attention she'd shown years ago, as if reading his character through his expression. "I hope we're not intruding. I know we should have written ahead. But you're always welcome here." The words came out with more force than he'd planned, colored by months of wondering and hoping. "Both of you." The boy had jumped down from the carriage and was staring at the ranch with obvious fascination. Everything about him radiated health and energy. His clothes were well made, if simple. His posture spoke of confidence, and his eyes held the bright intelligence that Silas remembered in Thomas. This was no starving waif or neglected child, but a young man who'd been raised with care and attention. "Samuel," Mary Catherine called softly. "Come meet Mr. McCrae." The boy approached with the easy manners of someone who'd been taught proper behavior but hadn't lost his natural curiosity. He offered his hand like a man, meeting Silas's gaze directly. "Pleased to meet you, sir. Ma's told me about your kindness to her during the storm. I'm grateful for what you did." The voice was deeper than Silas had expected, carrying the first hints of the man Samuel would become. And there, in the shape of his smile and the way he held his head when speaking, Silas saw Thomas so clearly it took his breath away. Not a perfect resemblance. The boy had his mother's nose and the stubborn set of her chin, but enough similarity to remove any doubt about his parentage. "The pleasure is mine, Samuel. Would you both come inside? Mrs. Patterson's just put coffee on, and I imagine you've had a long journey." As they walked toward the house, Silas found himself studying them both with new eyes. Mary Catherine moved with the confidence of a woman who'd found her place in the world, and her relationship with Samuel spoke of mutual respect and affection. Whatever hardships they'd endured, they'd clearly faced them together and emerged stronger for the experience. The sitting room felt different with their presence, warmer somehow, less like a museum of past glories and more like a home where people might actually live. Mary Catherine settled herself on the same sofa where she'd recovered from hypothermia. 3 years ago, while Samuel gravitated immediately toward the windows that looked out over the pastures where cattle grazed in the afternoon sun. "This is beautiful land," the boy said with genuine appreciation. "Ma told me you have one of the finest herds in Montana." "She told you that, did she?" Silas glanced at Mary Catherine, who colored slightly under his gaze. "And what else has your mother told you about the McCrae ranch?" Samuel looked between the adults, sensing undercurrents he didn't quite understand. "She said you were a good man who helped her when she needed it most. She said your family had a history of kindness to strangers." The careful phrasing suggested that Mary Catherine had told her son enough to prepare him for this visit without revealing the full truth of their connection. Silas found himself impressed by her discretion. She'd managed to explain their presence here without burdening the boy with complexities he might not be ready to understand. "Your mother is very generous in her assessment, but she's right about one thing: the McCrae family has always believed in helping those who need it." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Though I have to admit, I'm curious about what brings you both here today. It's been 3 years since we last met." Mary Catherine's composure wavered slightly, and she clasped her hands together in her lap. "I've been thinking about that night for a long time, Mr. McCrae, about your kindness and about other things. Samuel is almost grown now, ready to make his own way in the world. Before that happens, I felt there were things that needed to be said, things I should have told you years ago." The words hung in the air between them, pregnant with implications that made Silas's pulse quicken. Samuel, meanwhile, had discovered the photographs on the mantelpiece and was studying them with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "Ma," he said slowly, his voice carrying a note of wonder, "this soldier in the uniform, doesn't he look familiar to you?" Mary Catherine's face went pale, and Silas felt the moment arriving when pretense would no longer be possible. Thomas's photograph sat in its place of honor, and any resemblance between the young soldier and the boy studying his image would be impossible to dismiss. "Yes," Mary Catherine whispered, her voice barely audible. "He does look familiar, very familiar indeed." The silence that followed Samuel's observation stretched like a taut wire, heavy with the weight of secrets that could no longer be contained. Silas watched as Mary Catherine struggled with words that had been held back for nearly 18 years, her composure finally beginning to crack under the pressure of truth that demanded to be spoken. Samuel moved closer to the photograph, his young face intent with concentration. "The resemblance is quite striking, isn't it? He has the same eyes as—" The boy stopped mid-sentence, his hand rising instinctively to touch his own face as understanding began to dawn. "Ma, who is this man?" Mary Catherine rose from her chair with the careful movements of someone approaching a precipice, her hands trembling as she joined her son before the mantelpiece. For a long moment, she simply stared at Thomas's image, and Silas saw tears gathering in her eyes. "His name was Thomas McCrae," she said finally, her voice so soft it barely carried across the room. "He was Mr. McCrae's younger brother, and he died in the war before you were born." She paused, drawing a shaky breath. He was also your father, Samuel. The boy's face went through a rapid succession of emotions, confusion, disbelief, wonder, and finally a dawning recognition that seemed to illuminate his features from within. He looked back and forth between the photograph and Silas, seeing now what had been there all along, but never understood. My father, Samuel repeated slowly, as if testing the words for their weight and meaning. This soldier was my father. Yes. Mary Catherine's voice grew stronger with the relief of finally speaking truth. Thomas McCrae was the finest man I ever knew. He was gentle and brave and kind, and he loved us both before he ever got the chance to meet you. Silas found himself gripping the back of a chair for support, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. For years, he'd imagined this conversation in a dozen different ways, but the reality was more powerful than any scenario his mind had conjured. Samuel wasn't just Thomas's son, he was the living embodiment of his brother's love, the future Thomas had dreamed of during those dark months of war. "Why didn't you tell me before?" Samuel asked, his voice carrying the hurt of someone who'd grown up with questions, but no answers. "All these years, whenever I asked about my father, you'd just say he was a good man who died in the war. You never told me his name or that I had family." The pain in the boy's voice cut through Silas like a blade. Mary Catherine reached for her son's hands, her own shaking with emotion. "I was protecting you," she said urgently, "and protecting myself too, if I'm honest. When your father died, I was alone in the world with nowhere to turn. I was pregnant and frightened, with no way to prove my connection to the McCrae family, and no right to claim anything from them." She glanced at Silas, her eyes pleading for understanding. "I knew the McCraes were successful ranchers, but that only made me feel more like an outsider. What could I offer? What claim could I make?" Silas stepped forward, his heart aching for both of them. "You could have told me 3 years ago when you were here, when I helped you through the storm." "And said what?" Mary Catherine turned to face him fully, her cheeks flushed with old shame and new defiance. "Hello, Mr. McCrae. I'm the woman your brother loved, and this is his child. We've been struggling to survive for years while you've built an empire on land that might have been our home. It would have sounded like I was trying to take advantage of your kindness." From his vest pocket, Silas withdrew a small object he'd been carrying for weeks, a simple gold ring that had never been worn, never fulfilled its purpose. Thomas had bought it during their last leave together, speaking shyly of a woman he hoped to marry when the war ended. Silas had found it among his brother's effects, had kept it all these years as another memorial to dreams that died at Gettysburg. "He bought this for you," Silas said quietly, holding out the ring. "In February of 1864, just 2 months before he died. He told me he was going to ask someone to marry him when he got home, but he wouldn't tell me her name. Said he didn't want to jinx his luck by talking about it too much." Mary Catherine stared at the ring as if it were a ghost made solid, her breath catching in her throat. "He wrote to me about it," she whispered. "In his last letter, the one that arrived after the news of his death. He said he'd found a ring that reminded him of spring flowers, and he hoped I'd like it when he could. Finally, give it to me properly." Samuel watched this exchange with growing comprehension, beginning to understand not just the facts of his parentage, but the depth of love that had created him. "He really loved you," he said, wonder coloring his voice. "Even though he died before I was born, he wanted to marry you and be my father." "More than anything in the world," Mary Catherine confirmed, accepting the ring with reverent hands. "Thomas McCrae was the kind of man who loved completely, without reservation. He would have been so proud of you, Samuel. So very proud." Silas found himself studying his nephew with new eyes, seeing not just Thomas's features, but glimpses of the man Samuel was becoming. The boy carried himself with quiet confidence, spoke with thoughtful consideration, and showed the kind of natural empathy that had made Thomas beloved by everyone who knew him. "I have letters," Silas said suddenly. Letters your mother wrote to Thomas during the war, and letters he wrote but never sent. He was going to give them to you someday, Samuel, when you were old enough to understand what kind of man your father was. Letters from my father. Samuel's voice cracked slightly with emotion. You mean he wrote to me before I was even born? He wrote about his hopes for you, his dreams of teaching you to ride and rope and understand the land. He carved toys for you, planned the room where you'd sleep when you came home to the ranch. Thomas might have died before he could hold you, but he loved you from the moment he learned you existed. The revelation seemed to overwhelm Samuel, who sank into the nearest chair with tears streaming down his face. Mary Catherine moved to comfort him, her own emotions barely controlled as she watched her son grapple with the enormity of what he was learning. All these years, Samuel managed between sobs, I thought I was nobody special. Just another boy without a father, nothing to distinguish me from 100 others. But I'm a McCrae. I have family, and a father who loved me, even though he never got to meet me. Silas felt his own composure cracking as he watched the scene unfold. This boy, this young man, was Thomas's legacy, the future his brother had died trying to secure. And Mary Catherine, who'd carried the burden of raising him alone, had done a magnificent job despite circumstances that would have broken lesser people. You're both family, Silas said firmly, his voice thick with emotion. You're the family Thomas wanted, the family I never knew I had. And if you'll have me, if you'll let me try to make up for lost time, I'd like nothing more than to be the Uncle Samuel never knew he had. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch house porch as Mary Catherine reached into her traveling bag with the careful movements of someone handling something precious and potentially explosive. The emotional revelations of the previous evening had left, all three of them drained but somehow lighter, as if years of carried secrets had finally found their proper place in the light of day. Samuel sat beside Silas on the porch steps, the two of them already falling into the easy companionship that seemed to run in McCrae blood. The boy had peppered his newfound uncle with questions about ranch life, about Thomas's childhood, about the legacy he was only beginning to understand. Silas found himself marveling at how natural it felt to have family again, how easily the loneliness of years could be filled by the simple presence of people who belonged. There's something else, Mary Catherine said quietly, interrupting their discussion of cattle breeding techniques. Something I should have shown you yesterday, but I needed time to work up the courage. Her fingers trembled slightly as she withdrew a leather portfolio, worn but well-maintained, tied with a ribbon that had faded from blue to grey over the years. Silas felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the sensation that had become associated with revelations that changed everything he thought he knew. What is it? Documents, Mary Catherine said simply. Legal papers that Thomas insisted on having drawn up before his final deployment. He said, if anything happened to him, he wanted to make sure his responsibilities were clear and legally binding. She untied the ribbon with careful fingers. I've carried these for 18 years, never quite knowing what to do with them. The first document she withdrew was a marriage certificate, official and properly witnessed, bearing the seal of a Virginia county clerk and dated the 15th of March, 1864. The names written in careful script made Silas's breath catch. Thomas Alexander McCrae and Mary Catherine O'Brien, joined in lawful matrimony just weeks before Thomas's final battle. You were married, Silas whispered, staring at the certificate as if it might vanish like smoke. You were actually married to him. In a small church outside Richmond, Mary Catherine confirmed. Thomas insisted, said he, wouldn't leave for his final deployment without making me his wife properly. The ceremony was simple, just us, the preacher, and 2 soldiers who served as witnesses. But it was real, and it was binding. Samuel leaned over to study the certificate, his young face serious with the weight of understanding. So you're really Mary McCrae, not Mary O'Brien, and I'm a legitimate son, not a... You were always legitimate in every way that mattered. Mary Catherine said firmly. "But yes, legally speaking, you're Samuel McCrae, born in wedlock to parents who loved each other completely." But it was the second document that made Silas's world tilt on its axis. A will, formal and witnessed, bearing Thomas's signature in the bold handwriting Silas remembered from childhood letters. The language was legal and precise, but its meaning was devastatingly clear. In the event of his death, Thomas Alexander McCrae left his entire inheritance, including his half-share of the family ranch, to his lawful wife and any children born of their union. Silas read the document twice, his legal training allowing him to parse the implications with growing horror. Under territorial law, Thomas's share of the ranch had never actually belonged to Silas at all. For 18 years, he'd been operating under the assumption that his brother's death had left him sole owner of the McCrae spread. But the law was clear: inherited property passed to surviving spouses and legitimate children before it reverted to siblings. "Do you understand what this means?" he asked quietly, his voice hollow with shock. Mary Catherine's face was pale but determined. "I understand exactly what it means. Samuel is the rightful heir to half of everything you've built here. Half the land, half the cattle, half the buildings and improvements, all of it should have been his from the moment he was born." The silence that followed was deafening. Samuel looked between the two adults, clearly struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what was being revealed. This wasn't just about finding his father's family anymore. This was about discovering he was entitled to a fortune he'd never known existed. "But I don't want," Samuel began, his voice cracking with distress. "I mean, you've worked so hard for all this. You've spent your whole life building this ranch. I can't just—" "The law doesn't care what you want," Silas interrupted, though not unkindly. "Or what I want, for that matter. These documents are legally binding. If you wanted to, you could go to court and claim immediate ownership of half of everything I've spent 18 years believing was mine." The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. For months, he'd been fighting off developers and railroad companies, trying to force him off his land through legal maneuvering and financial pressure. But the real threat to his ownership had been sitting in a leather portfolio, carried by a woman who'd been too proud and too frightened to assert her son's rights. Mary Catherine stood and walked to the porch railing, staring out at the vast expanse of the McCrae ranch with eyes that held both wonder and sorrow. "I never wanted to take anything from you," she said quietly. "When I came here 3 years ago, I was desperate and alone, but I wasn't looking for charity or claiming inheritance. I just needed help, and you gave it freely." "Then why show me these documents now?" Silas asked. "Why not just let sleeping dogs lie?" She turned back to face him, and he saw in her expression the same quiet strength that had allowed her to survive 18 years of hardship while raising Thomas's son alone. "Because Samuel deserves to know who he really is. And because there's something else you need to understand, something that makes this all more complicated than a simple inheritance dispute." From the portfolio, she withdrew a third document, a letter bearing an official government seal and the letterhead of a territorial land office. The date was recent, just 2 months old, and the contents made Silas's blood run cold. "I've been receiving correspondence from land developers," Mary Catherine continued. "Men who've somehow learned about Samuel's legal claim to the ranch. They've been pressuring me to assert his inheritance rights, offering to handle all the legal proceedings in exchange for the right to purchase his share immediately upon recognition." The pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place with sickening clarity. The increased pressure on valley ranchers, the accelerated timeline for development projects, the mysterious efficiency with which surrounding properties had been acquired, it all pointed to a coordinated campaign that was more sophisticated than simple business opportunism. "They know," Silas said grimly. "Somehow these developers have researched the land titles thoroughly enough to discover Thomas's will. They've been planning to use Samuel's claim as a way to force the sale of the ranch." "That's what I believe, yes. The letters I've received are carefully worded, but the implication is clear. Assert Samuel's claim and sell immediately, or they'll find ways to assert it for him through legal action that could tie up the property for years. Samuel had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm, his young face reflecting the weight of adult responsibilities he wasn't prepared to shoulder. So, if I claim what's legally mine, I destroy Uncle Silas's life work. But if I don't, these developers will find other ways to force us off the land anyway. That seems to be the situation. Yes, Mary Catherine confirmed sadly. Silas felt the walls of his carefully ordered world closing in around him. For months, he'd been fighting to preserve the ranch as a memorial to Thomas, never knowing that the key to its destruction lay in the very family he'd been hoping to find. The developers hadn't needed to outmaneuver him legally or financially. They'd simply needed to locate the rightful heir and convince him to claim what was already his. There has to be another way, Samuel said urgently. Some solution that doesn't require choosing between family loyalty and legal rights. Uncle Silas, you've been like a father to this land for 18 years. I can't just take that away from you. But even as the boy spoke, Silas could see the trap closing around them. The developers had been patient and thorough, researching not just current ownership but historical claims that could be used to destabilize property rights. Whether Samuel asserted his inheritance or not, the legal uncertainty would be enough to prevent Silas from securing loans, making improvements, or fighting off future challenges. The ranch that had been his life's work, the legacy he'd built in Thomas's memory, was slipping away from him through the actions of the very family he'd wanted to protect. The irony was so complete it felt like the punchline to a cosmic joke he'd found his brother's son, only to discover that finding him might cost him everything. Thomas had died, trying to preserve. The leather-bound journal felt heavy in Silas's hands, its pages yellowed with age and soft from countless readings. He'd discovered it the evening before, hidden in the false bottom of Thomas's old trunk beneath layers of carefully preserved letters and documents. The journal contained his brother's most private thoughts during those final months of the war, including detailed plans for the ranch's future that read like a prophetic blueprint for everything Silas had unknowingly accomplished in the years since. "Listen to this," Silas said, his voice rough with emotion as Mary Catherine and Samuel gathered around him in the ranch house parlor. Outside, storm clouds were building again, but this time they brought the promise of change rather than mere weather. Thomas wrote this in February of 1864, just weeks before he died. He opened to a page marked with a pressed wildflower, its petals still holding a ghost of their original purple color. The McCrae land must remain in family hands, passed down through generations who understand its value beyond mere dollars and cents. This valley has the potential to sustain not just cattle, but a way of life that honors both the land and the people who work it. When I return from this war, I intend to build something lasting, a ranch that can support multiple families, provide employment for good men, and serve as a sanctuary for anyone who needs shelter from life's storms. Samuel leaned forward, his green eyes bright with interest. He really thought about all that, even while he was fighting? "Your father was a visionary," Silas replied, turning to another marked page. He goes on to describe a plan for expanding the operation, diversifying beyond cattle to include sheep and horses, even establishing a small settlement where ranch workers could raise their families permanently instead of drifting from job to job. Mary Catherine touched the journal's edge reverently. "He used to write to me about those dreams. I thought they were just the fantasies of a young man trying to imagine a future beyond the war. They were more than fantasies. Look here." Silas pointed to a detailed sketch Thomas had drawn, showing the ranch laid out exactly as it existed today, complete with additional buildings and improvements that wouldn't be constructed for another decade. He planned everything. "We've built the expanded bunkhouse, the breeding barn, even the location of the new well we dug 5 years ago. It's all here, mapped out like he could see the future. But it was the final entry that had kept Silas awake all night, reading and rereading words that seemed to speak directly across the years to their current crisis. The ranch will face challenges that could threaten its survival, Thomas had written in his careful script. Outside forces may try to break up the land for profit, to transform it into something it was never meant to be. When that time comes, the family must stand together. Unity of purpose will be our only defense against those who see the valley as nothing more than an opportunity for exploitation. The prophetic nature of the words sent chills down Silas's spine. Thomas had somehow anticipated the exact situation they now faced: external pressure to sell. Family members forced to choose between personal gain and collective preservation, the future of the ranch hanging in the balance. He knew, Samuel whispered, his young voice filled with awe. Somehow, he knew this would happen. Your father understood that land like this would always be valuable to the wrong people for the wrong reasons, Mary Catherine said softly. He was trying to protect it from exactly what we're facing now. Over the past 3 days, they'd been working together to understand the full scope of the threat facing the ranch. The developers weren't operating. Randomly, their campaign to acquire valley properties was part of a larger plan that would transform the entire region. Railroad access was just the beginning. Mining operations would follow, along with the hotels, saloons, and businesses that supported industrial development. Jake Henley had brought disturbing news from town. They're not just making offers anymore, he'd reported grimly. They're researching property titles going back 50 years, looking for any irregularity they can exploit in court. Word is, they've got lawyers working full-time on finding ways to challenge ownership claims. The strategy was becoming clear: create legal uncertainty around property rights, then swoop in with cash offers that would seem attractive compared to years of expensive litigation. Samuel's inheritance claim was just one weapon in their arsenal, but it was a powerful one that could tie up the ranch indefinitely while court battles raged. Dr. Thornton had joined their strategy sessions, bringing both wisdom and connections that proved invaluable. I've seen this pattern before, the old doctor had explained. Down in Colorado, they use similar tactics to break up established ranches and mining claims. Once they get a foothold, they move fast. Within 2 years. Entire communities can be transformed beyond recognition. But the doctor had also brought hope in the form of legal precedents that might work in their favor. If you can prove the family unity, Thomas wrote about, if you can demonstrate that the inheritance is being used to preserve rather than destroy the ranch's original purpose, the courts tend to look favorably on that. Judges don't like seeing established operations broken up for pure speculation. This had led to intense discussions about how to structure a legal response that would protect both Samuel's inheritance rights and the ranch's future. Mary Catherine had surprised everyone with her knowledge of territorial law. Years of struggling to survive had forced her to become familiar with legal protections for widows and orphans. We don't have to choose between Samuel's claim and preserving the ranch, she'd argued during one late-night planning session. We can restructure the ownership as a family partnership, with shares allocated according to contribution and need rather than simple inheritance law. The idea had merit, but implementing it would require careful legal work and absolute family unity at a time when outside pressures were intensifying daily. Representatives from the development company had begun appearing at neighboring ranches with increasing frequency, and rumors suggested they were preparing to make a comprehensive push that would target remaining holdouts simultaneously. Samuel had thrown himself into ranch work with the dedication of someone trying to prove his worthiness, learning skills that seemed to come naturally despite his urban upbringing. Silas watched. His nephew master the basics of cattle handling and horse training with the same quiet competence Thomas had shown at that age. He's got the gift, Tommy Rodriguez observed after watching Samuel work with a difficult colt. That horse settled down for him like he was speaking its language. The boy's got McCrae blood, all right. More than blood, Samuel possessed the same gentle strength that had made Thomas beloved by both animals and people. Watching him interact with the ranch hands, listening to him ask thoughtful questions about sustainable land management, Silas began to understand that Thomas's vision for the ranch's future wasn't just possible. It was already taking shape through his son's natural leadership abilities. The breakthrough came when Mary Catherine discovered additional documents in her late father's papers, legal precedents from similar cases where family partnerships had successfully resisted corporate takeover attempts. The key was demonstrating that the inheritance was being used to fulfill the original owner's intentions rather than subvert them. "We can file a joint claim," she explained excitedly. "Samuel asserts his inheritance rights, not to break up the ranch, but to ensure its preservation according to Thomas's documented wishes. Silas remains as managing partner, Samuel becomes heir apparent, and the land stays in family hands under legal protection that makes it much harder for outside interests to challenge." It was elegant. In its simplicity, used Samuel's legitimate claim as a shield rather than a sword, turning the developer's weapon against them while strengthening rather than weakening the family's position. But the plan would require perfect execution and absolute trust between people who were still learning to be family. They would need to present a united front in legal proceedings where any sign of internal conflict could be exploited by corporate lawyers skilled in finding weaknesses. As they finalized their strategy, Silas found himself thinking about the wooden horse Thomas had carved, now sitting on Samuel's bedside table, a reminder that the best plans meant nothing if the people implementing them didn't have the courage to see them through. The storm outside was intensifying, but inside the ranch house, 3 generations of McCraes were preparing to fight for something that mattered. More than money or individual gain, they were fighting for Thomas's vision of a future where land and family were inseparable, where the values that built the West could survive the forces that sought to transform it beyond recognition. Tomorrow, they would take their case to court, where legal documents and family unity would be tested against corporate power and political influence. The outcome would determine not just the fate of the McCrae ranch, but whether the dreams of one young soldier could survive the brutal pragmatism of a changing world. As thunder rolled across the valley, Silas looked at his brother's son and daughter-in-law, no longer strangers bound by tragedy, but family, united by hope, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since Thomas's death, he wasn't fighting alone. The territorial courthouse in Helena had never seen a crowd quite like the one that gathered on that crisp October morning. Ranchers who rarely left their spreads had made the long journey to witness what many saw as a test case that would determine the future of land ownership throughout the territory. The McCrae family's legal challenge had drawn attention far beyond their local valley, becoming a symbol of whether established families could resist the tide of corporate development sweeping across the West. Silas sat at the plaintiff's table with Mary, Catherine, and Samuel, the leather portfolio containing their family's documentation open before them, like a battle plan made manifest. Across the courtroom, representatives from Consolidated Western Development had assembled an impressive legal team, 3 lawyers in expensive suits, flanked by surveyors and land assessors whose presence spoke to the scope of their ambitions. Judge Harrison Caldwell, a territorial appointee known for his fairness and deep knowledge of land law, called the court to order with the gravity appropriate to a case that would set precedents for years to come. The family Bible that Mary Catherine had requested be present lay open on the council table, its pages containing the handwritten family tree that documented 3 generations of McCrae ownership. This court will now hear arguments in the matter of McCrae versus Consolidated Western Development regarding disputed ownership claims to the McCrae Ranch property in Dry Hollow Valley, Judge Caldwell announced. "Counselors, you may proceed." Their lawyer, Matthew Harrison, a Helena attorney recommended by Dr. Thornton, rose with the confidence of a man who believed deeply in his case. Your Honor, this proceeding concerns more than simple property rights. It concerns the fundamental question of whether legal inheritance should be used to preserve family legacies or destroy them. Harrison's opening statement laid out their position with methodical precision. Samuel McCrae was indeed the legal heir to half the ranch, as documented by his father's will and actside marriage certificate. However, rather than seeking to divide the property, the family was petitioning the court to recognize a partnership structure that would honor both inheritance law and the original owner's documented intentions. Thomas McCrae's journal, which we submit as evidence, clearly demonstrates his vision for the property as a family enterprise that would remain intact across generations. Harrison continued. The developer's attempt to exploit inheritance law to force a sale directly contradicts the deceased owner's explicit wishes. Samuel had insisted on testifying, personally, despite his youth and the intimidating nature of formal proceedings. When called to the witness stand, he spoke with the quiet dignity that seemed to be his natural inheritance, his words carrying weight beyond his years. Your Honor, I never knew my father, but I've spent weeks reading his letters and journal entries. He didn't just want to own land, he wanted to create something lasting that would benefit not just his family, but everyone who worked the ranch and lived in the valley. Samuel's voice grew stronger as he continued. I could claim my inheritance and sell immediately for more money than I ever imagined, but that would destroy everything my father died trying to build. The courtroom was completely silent as Samuel concluded his testimony. I want to inherit my father's vision, not just his property. And his vision was about keeping families together, not tearing them apart for profit. Mary Catherine's testimony proved equally compelling, her quiet strength evident as she described 18 years of struggle that had ended not in bitterness, but in a desire to honor her late husband's dreams. I kept Thomas's letters and documents not because I planned to use them someday, but because they were all I had left of the man I loved. When I finally brought our son to meet his uncle, it wasn't to claim inheritance, it was to give Samuel the family Thomas had always wanted him to have. But it was Silas's testimony that brought the moral weight of their argument into sharp focus. Speaking directly to Judge Caldwell, he laid out the case for family unity with the passion of a man fighting for something more valuable than money. Your Honor, I've spent 18 years building this ranch in my brother's memory. Every fence, post, every head of cattle, every improvement was made with the intention of preserving what our family started. Now I discover that Thomas had a son, and instead of seeing this as a threat to what I've built, I see it as the completion of what we both dreamed. Samuel isn't here to take the ranch. From me, he's here to help me fulfill the purpose it was always meant to serve. The developer's lawyers countered with arguments about legal precedent and property rights, insisting that inheritance law was clear and that emotional appeals couldn't supersede established legal principles. They painted the McCrae family's proposal as a dangerous precedent that would allow heirs to manipulate inheritance law to avoid financial obligations. But their arguments felt hollow against the weight of family testimony and documentary evidence that spoke to deeper values than mere legal technicality. When Consolidated Western's lead attorney attempted to characterize Samuel as a tool being manipulated by his uncle to avoid legitimate inheritance claims, the young man's dignified response drew audible approval from the packed courtroom. Sir, I'm not being manipulated by anyone. I'm 18 years old enough to understand right from wrong, and old enough to choose family over money. Judge Caldwell's chambers felt smaller with the weight of decision hanging in the air. The morning's testimony had concluded with both sides presenting their final arguments, and now the judge was preparing to render a verdict that would reshape not just the McCrae family's future, but the legal landscape for inheritance disputes throughout the territory. When court reconvened after the lunch recess, the packed gallery fell silent as Judge Caldwell took his seat. The new will that Silas had prepared the document that would formalize their family partnership, sat ready for signing, but only if the court ruled in their favor. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence presented, Judge Caldwell began, his voice carrying the authority of years on the territorial bench. This court finds that the inheritance claim presented by Samuel McCrae is legally valid and binding under territorial law. A murmur ran through the courtroom, and Silas felt his heart sink. If the judge stopped there, the developers would have won. Samuel's claim would stand alone, creating the legal uncertainty they needed to force a sale. But Judge Caldwell wasn't finished. However, this court also finds that inheritance law must be interpreted in the context of the deceased's documented intentions and the broader principles of family preservation that form the foundation of territorial property rights. The judge's eyes swept the courtroom, settling on the McCrae family with something that might have been approval. The evidence clearly shows that Thomas McCrae intended his property to serve as the foundation for a multi-generational family enterprise. His journal entries, his letters, and his legal preparations all point to a vision of collaborative rather than individual ownership. The court therefore recognizes the family partnership proposal as consistent with both inheritance law and the deceased's explicit wishes. Relief flooded through Silas like a physical force, and he saw tears streaming down Mary Catherine's face as she reached for Samuel's hand. Their young lawyer, Matthew Harrison, was already reaching for the partnership documents, understanding that they had moments to formalize the victory before anyone could raise objections. Furthermore, Judge Caldwell continued, his voice growing stern as he addressed the developer's legal team, "This court finds that Consolidated Western Development's attempts to exploit family inheritance disputes for commercial gain represents a troubling pattern of behavior that undermines the stability of property rights throughout the territory." The judge's next words sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Investigation into the company's acquisition methods in this and other cases reveals systematic attempts to create legal uncertainty where none previously existed, using research into historical property claims to pressure established landowners into disadvantageous sales. Such practices are inconsistent with the territorial government's commitment to supporting established agricultural enterprises. Silas watched as the developer's lawyers exchanged worried glances, clearly understanding that their broader strategy had been exposed and condemned by a territorial judge whose rulings carried weight far beyond this single case. Judge Caldwell turned his attention back to the McCrae family. "Samuel McCrae, as the legal heir to your father's estate, do you agree to enter into the partnership arrangement outlined in the documents before the court?" Samuel stood with the same quiet dignity he'd shown throughout the proceedings. "Yes, Your Honor. I want to honor my father's vision and work with my uncle to preserve what our family built." "Silas McCrae, do you agree to restructure the ranch ownership to recognize your nephew's inheritance rights while maintaining operational continuity?" "Absolutely, Your Honor. Samuel is Thomas's son, and this ranch belongs to both of us." The signing ceremony that followed felt like a celebration rather than a legal formality. Community leaders who had traveled to witness the proceedings offered congratulations, and even some of the smaller ranchers who had been considering developers' offers seemed to take heart from the McCrae family's victory. Mary Catherine approached Silas as the courtroom began to empty, her eyes bright with tears of gratitude. "Thomas would be so proud," she said simply. "Not just of what we accomplished today, but of the man his son is becoming and the uncle who helped make it possible." Samuel had been surrounded by well-wishers, but he broke away to join them, his young face beaming with pride and relief. "So we did it? The ranch is really safe now?" "As safe as legal documents can make it," Silas replied, pulling his nephew into an embrace that felt like the completion of something that had been broken for too long. "But more importantly, we're family now, all three of us, working together just like your father wanted." "Doctor," Thornton, who had been waiting patiently at the edge of the crowd, finally approached with the smile of a man whose faith in human nature had been vindicated. "Thomas McCrae was my friend for 40 years, he said quietly. If he could see his son and his brother standing together today, fighting for what he believed in, he'd know that his sacrifice wasn't in vain. As they walked out of the courthouse into the crisp Montana evening, Silas felt something he hadn't experienced since before the war. A sense of complete family, of belonging to something larger than himself. The partnership document in his pocket represented more than legal protection. It represented the fulfillment of a promise he'd made to his brother's memory 18 years ago. The ranch would continue, not as a monument to the past, but as a foundation for the future, just as Thomas had always dreamed it would be. 6 months had passed since the courthouse victory, and the McCrae ranch hummed with a vitality that had been missing for years. The new sign at the property's entrance, hand-carved by Samuel during the winter months, read, "McCrae and Son Ranch," in bold letters that could be seen from the main road. Below the family name, smaller script added, "Established 1855, preserved for future generations," a promise that carried the weight of legal protection and family commitment. Spring had come early too. Dry, hollow valley, painting the pastures in shades of green that seemed almost impossibly vibrant after the harsh winter. Silas stood on the ranch house porch, watching Samuel work with the new colt they'd bought at auction the previous month. The boy, though at 18, he was hardly a boy. Anymore had developed into a natural horseman with an intuitive understanding of animal behavior that reminded everyone of Thomas. "He's got the gift all right," Jake Henley observed, joining Silas to watch the training session. "That colt was wild as a March hare when we brought him home, and look at him now. Samuel's got him eating out of his hand." Mary Catherine emerged from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands on the apron that had become as much a part of her daily uniform as Samuel's work boots and hat. She'd thrown herself into ranch life with the determination of someone making up for lost time, learning to cook for a dozen ranch hands while somehow making it look effortless. "Dinner in an hour," she announced, settling beside Silas with the easy familiarity that had developed over months of shared meals and family conversations. "Tommy caught fresh trout this morning, and Maria's teaching me her recipe for cornbread that the men seem to think is worth fighting over." The transformation in their daily routines had been gradual but profound. Where the ranch house had once echoed with emptiness, it now bustled with the comfortable chaos of family life. Samuel's books from his correspondence courses were scattered across the parlor table, mixed with ranch ledgers and veterinary manuals. Mary Catherine's sewing basket sat beside Silas's reading chair, and the kitchen always seemed to have something delicious simmering on the stove. But it was the letter that had arrived that morning that truly captured the magnitude of change in their circumstances. Silas pulled the envelope from his vest pocket, still marveling at its contents. "What news from town?" Mary Catherine asked, noting his expression. "Consolidated Western Development is withdrawing from Montana operations entirely," Silas replied, unable to keep the satisfaction from his voice. "Seems our court case opened up investigations in 3 other territories, and they're facing enough legal challenges to keep them busy for years. The pressure on valley ranchers has disappeared virtually overnight. The developers' aggressive tactics had collapsed like a house of cards once their methods were exposed to legal scrutiny. Other families who'd been pressured to sell had found the courage to resist, and the territorial government had begun implementing new regulations designed to protect established agricultural operations from predatory acquisition schemes. Samuel looked up from his work with the colt, his face bright with curiosity. "Does that mean the Murphy place might come back on the market? I've been thinking about your father's plans for expansion, Uncle Silas. If we could acquire some of the adjacent properties legitimately, we could implement his vision for a larger operation that supports multiple families." The suggestion was pure, Thomas, thoughtful, ambitious, and focused on community benefit rather than individual gain. Over the winter months, Samuel had studied his father's journal with the intensity of a scholar, absorbing not just the technical details of ranch management, but the philosophical framework that had guided Thomas's thinking. "We'll see what becomes available," Silas replied, "but there's no rush. Your father's vision was built on patience and careful planning, not quick expansion." Dr. Thornton's weekly visits had become social occasions rather than medical necessity, opportunities for the old physician to share stories about Thomas's childhood and offer gentle guidance as Samuel navigated the complexities of young adulthood. This evening, he'd brought news that the territorial legislature was considering the McCrae case as a model for new inheritance protection laws. "You've started something bigger than you might have realized," the doctor observed over dinner. "Families throughout the territory are taking heart from your example, standing up to pressure they might have surrendered to before." As the sun set over the valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that rivaled any masterpiece, the 3 generations of McCraes gathered on the porch for their evening ritual. Samuel would read aloud from Thomas's letters, while Mary Catherine mended clothes or worked on the quilt she was making for his bed. Silas would share stories about the ranch's history or plans for upcoming seasons, weaving past and future into a continuous narrative. "Listen to this," Samuel said, opening to a letter dated just weeks before Thomas's death. "My dearest Mary Catherine, I dream of evenings when our family gathers to watch the sun set over our valley, when the work of the day is done and we can simply enjoy the peace of being together in the place we've made, our own." The words hung in the evening air like a benediction, a reminder that some dreams survive even when the dreamers do not. Thomas might never have lived to see his vision fulfilled, but his son was implementing it with the same gentle strength and thoughtful determination that had made his father beloved by everyone who knew him. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Silas reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A simple act of kindness on a storm-swept night had set in motion a chain of events that restored not just family unity, but hope for the future. The woman who'd appeared half-frozen on his porch had brought with her the missing pieces of a puzzle he hadn't even known was incomplete. The McCrae Ranch would continue now, not as a monument to the past, but as Thomas had always intended, a living enterprise that honored tradition, while embracing the future. A place where family meant more than blood and kindness remained the foundation of all meaningful relationships.